you said you got some good feedback from the last one that we did. What was particularly helpful for people?
Yeah, first off, everybody was just like blown away. They were like, "Oh my God, she has so much education." And then she said she's a baby doctor. Like they were really impressed with your level of expertise and how long you trained in this stuff, and then your humility.
Well, I mean, I am a baby doctor, really, honestly, compared to, the average Tibetan doctor that practices in the East, for
Right.
sure. Yeah.
Well, I think it just was good for them to give them a peek. We're in this hyper capitalism consumer where everybody's like, I know everything and blah blah blah. So that was refreshing. And
Uh-huh.
then the channels, everybody found that fascinating, but they were like, "Oh my gosh, it was a lot." Um, so I had people say, "Well, they're going to take notes and all this." So it was really good. Like people were really excited. Um, yeah, I wasn't like surprised, but I mean, I don't always get immediate feedback after a podcast, and with yours, I did. So I'm glad we decided to do the rest of these.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean it's an interesting thing. I have this this story of, as I'm watching Tibetan medicine sort of blossom in the West. I mean, when I started, there was like nothing. The only way for me to study was to go abroad. Um, um, and even to this day, there's only two Americans who have ever done it the way that I did it. And the other is Tawny Tidwell, and she did it even better. Like, so we are good friends. We say it's in the water. She's from Colorado as well. We actually went to the same middle school and the same high school. She's just junior than me. And she's a double doctor. She's a PhD and a Tibetan doctor. And she went abroad and she was young enough that they let her into the actual school at Minsikong. So she did 2 years in Minsikong and then she actually finished up in Tibet. So she's also my nickname for her is Madame Manjushri because she's so smart. Her Tibetan is flawless, and we're really good friends. And it's an interesting thing, right? To train abroad and then to start to see people start to train here. And it's like, um, I remember when I first came back from India after being there for 2 years solid, and I stopped in England. A friend of mine brought me to Oxford to sort of rest because I was actually pregnant at the time. And so I went to rest and I went into this bookstore in Oxford. And like the first thing that I saw in the display was like chakras in a box, right?
Oh,
Like your chakras explained, whatever. And I was like, oh my God, I'm back in the West. So as I'm starting to see Tibetan medicine sort of rise, I'm on this like one woman show of trying to bring really authentic Tibetan medicine. I'm one of the original, I'm the longest standing in America that has studied fully, and somebody supersedes me in Canada. But other than that, I've been at it the longest. And so I have this very heavy weight on my shoulder of trying to do it in a culturally appropriate way. Um, and so I do consider myself a baby doctor because there's so much more to learn. So lifetimes and lifetimes. Yeah. Yeah. So it's good. It's good for people to get that perspective if they feel like they want to study. And Buddhism is the same way.
right. Well, that's
Yeah.
what I like what you're because it's honest, and it shows people like, the depth of this stuff. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Don't really appreciate I mean, it's a lifetime,
Or
bare
lifetimes.
minimum. But I mean that realistic view, like, you don't need to be stressing and striving. Just do the best you can, but it's going to be every day, every day, every day.
Mhm. I like to think of learning medicine as like putting a bookmark in something. Like you put a bookmark, you come back, you study again. Like it's said, according to the root tantra, like everything is in the root tantra. So we have four tantras of Tibetan medicine. Everything we need is actually in the root tantra. It's interdependence expressed in the most minute, finite, and simplistic way that it's said that if you are really sharp and very, very clever, you get it on the first go. But if you're a little dull, then the medicine Buddha goes on to explain the second tantra. And then traditionally we skip to the we skip the third tantra and we go to the fourth tantra, which is all of the herbs and the external therapies and all of the things that we sort of do to people. And then if you're really stupid, then you get the secret oral tantra, which is the line by line, like this symptom shows this way, shows in this exact pattern, and you give this herb for this long, and then you look for this, and then you do this. So the more I study and teach, the more I realize, like, no, it's really all as like an essence. Buddhism is so much about essence, isn't it? It's really pith instructions and whether or not those pith instructions wake you up to interdependence and phenomena. And so medicine is a lot like that, where there's these very pith instructions given in the root tantra. And if we can quiet ourselves to understand how nature works, then we can see pathophysiology before it blossoms. So we can catch a disease before it manifests, or we can see the root causation of someone's physical suffering, in process or before process, or headed off before we have to get to the secret oral tantra, which is the very last thing that you come to if you're really unclever and you really need detailed instructions. So that's why it's taught last. It's kind of like I had one teacher, Punsak Wangmo, she said, formulas are like your pocket money. If you know what the elements are doing, if you know what the pathophysiology is revealing to you, diet and behavior is really all you need. So formulas are really pocket money. External therapies are really pocket money. Or the way I describe it, it's like the four legs of a stool. If you really understand how the elements form and move and who's pushing who, then you have the opportunity to really put some ground under that. And I would say Buddhism is like that too. People really often, they want the bells, they want the like vajras, they want the fancy drums, they all want to do chud, they all want to do like the fancy visualizations, they want to have the big empowerments. But it all comes back to that same story of the woman that was so devoted to the dog tooth. Do you know that story?
Go, you can tell because the viewers might not.
So, this woman was in Tibet and her son was going to the Holy Lands of India. And she was like, bring me something, bring me something. And he's like, okay, mom. So then he comes home and he's on his way home and he's almost to his village and he's like, oh no, I forgot to bring my mom something from Holy India. And he sees this dead dog on the side of the road. So he pulls out a tooth and he brings it to her and he's like, this is the tooth of the Buddha. And so she reverently, like, does prostration. She puts it at a very high, sort of important placement on the shrine. And every day she makes offerings to this tooth. And every day the son is feeling like really guilty and very, oh my God, look at my mother. Wow. And so in his mind, she's just sort of doing this devotion kind of blindly without like any kind of substance behind it. But the devotion is actually the main key point here. And when people are doing sadhanas and when they were doing any kind of mantras, the connection to the energy of the deity is actually the juice. It's not the drums and it's not the like calling and the thigh bone trumpet and the all the other, waving your hands around and doing the certain mudras. It's really the heartfelt devotional connection to the energy that deity is waking up in your own channels. And so when this mother dies, of course, there's these like signs of attainment, and everybody's like really shocked. She's illiterate. So this is a very old story that you'll hear in circles of Buddhism, but it's a great example of how, just like that in medicine or just in practice, one of my favorite practice prescriptions is actually shamatha practice, because shamatha practice people think it's just the groundwork, that it's just learning how to place your mind so that you can then begin to visualize other practices. But what they don't realize is that shamatha is a complete Dzogchen practice in and of itself. And you can completely attain the rainbow body doing nothing but just shamatha, just placing your mind. And I think we had mentioned last time how, these enlightened masters, they sort of live in the duality of, samadhi or great understanding and pleasure. And then they can also see equally the amounts of suffering and pain. And for them, there's no distinction, right? It's like watching two rivers blend together, right? They just meet and flow together. And that's very much what shamatha practice is allowing people to just sit with what's flowing and arising without getting off your seat, being able to sit with that duality and to be able to clean the channels and sort of clean into the subtle level and then attain enlightenment. So I think it's really important that people sort of give themselves a chance in the West to not necessarily always chase after the really fancy empowerments and making sure that they can do their mudra just so and their trumpet just so. What they really need to work on is having that connection or that devotion.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well said. Very clear. But like you said, that's a very subtle thing, and people miss it. Uh, so you said there, like you can sit and rest in the shamatha and clean the channels. Like what? What do you? That's provocative. What do you mean by that? Because normally we think
So
there has to be some big
have
work
you have you ever seen the tanka of the shamatha tanka
with the.
with the elephant and the monkey and the yeah, so we begin with this wild monkey. And the monkey, of course, is our mind. It's always representing the wild monkey mind. And it's out of control. If you've ever been in Asia, you've seen the monkeys like jumping around. Woo! They see people, they think they know you have food.
Yeah.
Um, so they're after you. So the monkey is kind of in front, and then there's this giant elephant, this giant black elephant. And so this monk is kind of running after them. And that's kind of like when you begin shamatha practice, when you first sit down, everything is chaotic. It's like sitting next to a waterfall. It's like shh, like the noise of our own internal presence is so loud that it's very distracting, right? So we're just running after that. So the elephant represents the gross, actual physical form, the body, the meat sack, the like possession of this human form that we have temporarily. That's the representation of the elephant. And the monkey is the representation of the mind. And so when we begin our shamatha practice and we're trying to learn just to seat the mind, we're running after our body, we're running after our mind. Everything else is happening to us. It's not happening within us, we could say, right?
Yeah.
We don't necessarily experience it. We get a disease and we say we got a disease. Yeah,
Mm.
we didn't have a disease. A disease arose within us.
Mm.
It has a causation. So it's the same kind of principle. So that's that big old elephant. And then, he eventually learns how to do a little bit of meditation and he lassos the monkey. So he grasps the mind. This is when we have those nanoseconds of clarity that then we go, "Oh, I have clarity." And then we get really attached to the clarity and we like it all gets lost. So then we have to do it again. So that's the returning to the point of meditation of looking for your object of support. So shamatha really emphasizes your object of support. Your object of support is very easy to use your breath because your breath is always with you. We have this somatic nervous system where we can feel the breathing in, we can feel the breathing out, we can have the pause. I just was in a yoga class yesterday morning and she was like having us do the box breathing, which is a brilliant um, sort of modernization of understanding how to pause on that moment of breath and then like let that go and then you can
Yeah.
shift the size of the box or whatnot. So, we're slowing down, we're learning how to place the mind. And as we do that, we've lassoed the mind in a sense, where we can sit down and maybe in a 45-minute session of shamatha, we might have like 2 to 5 minutes of calm before we get unseated again. And then we just continue to practice. We continue to use the object of support. It can also be a Buddha statue, it can be a mandala, it can be a candle. If I'm teaching in a big retreat, I tell people look for the speck on the floor in front of you, right? So it can be all of these different things that we use to kind of ground our mind. So we're holding that monkey, and the monkey is now less in charge, but he's still kind of pulling us forward. But what's happening to the elephant is the elephant starts to change its color. So it goes from this dark color into this sort of white color. So that's the purification that starts to happen on the gross level of the body. So that's happening in your channels, just like Nundro is a purification of the channels. It's the same principle, but you're just doing it with meditation.
Hmm.
And so eventually the monk is walking in the front, and then this little tiny rabbit appears on top of the elephant at some point. And this rabbit wasn't there in the beginning. That rabbit is also of a dark color, and it represents the subtle aspects of the physical form. So this is the subtle body that we're dealing with. So this is more that sort of deeper
Hmm.
channel level awareness that we didn't really even realize we had until we've settled the mind. So we're no longer sitting next to the big waterfall with the noise. And in shamatha, it talks about how, the original master Sakyamipam Rinpoche talked about how eventually it's kind of like, I like to use the image of a National Geographic kind of aerial view of a river where you see it kind of meandering and then it turns and then it has a long straight stretch. And if you think about a river like that, that's moved from the waterfall to just a river, there's going to be moments where it tumbles and rushes. There's going to be moments when it kind of um, will get caught up in a whirlwind. That's like a whirlwind of thought where we have the same thought over and over again about the email that we need to send for work or whatever. And then we catch ourselves in our meditation and we realize, oh, thinking, we return to the breath. We return to the candle flame, to the speck on the floor. So then we eventually get out of that water wheel and then we go on again. And then we'll have moments of really placid sort of stillness start to come. And then it goes fast again. So it's kind of like this river, our mind starts to kind of have moments of stability. And in that stability, we become aware more of our somatic sensations in our body. That's where sometimes we can easily get distracted by, oh, my the tension in my upper back. And then, we readjust, we do the seven postures, the Vajrachana postures, which actually work directly with the winds, and we, just tipping the chin forward, for example, opens up the back of the cervical vertebrae and allows the energy to flow up to the head a lot easier. And oftentimes when we're meditating for a long time, we end up like this, where we're tipping our head back and somehow we've just done that, or we slouch,
Hmm.
or we get sleepy and heavy. So we're always kind of really not allowing that smooth flow of energy.
Yeah.
And so, we make readjustments, we have more stability, where there's an easier flow. And then eventually it's described that you get to the ocean. So the great vast ocean of awareness, right?
Hmm.
The change that's happening on the subtle and gross level of the body is you start to see a representation of that where the elephant is actually becoming more and more white in color because it's cleaned some of that gross form. So some of those channels are not mucked up with ignorance, very roughly ignorance, which is the earth and water element and makes the pagan kind of nature or energy that we primarily work with, or it could be our anger, right? It could be that root poison that we are clearing from our channels, or it could be our attachment. Whatever our little favorite choices are, we start to become more aware of them, just like we're in charge. We're not, the monkey's not running wild. Eventually, the monkey doesn't even need to be on the lasso because it's so tame that
Mhm.
it's calmed its own mind enough to be able to have that seat the mind. And so the rabbit itself, as you become more aware of the subtle body and that cleansing happens, the rabbit itself disappears from the tanka because it's no longer I have a subtle body and a gross body. It's the same body, right? It's the same form. We're not having them be this separate entity where we're trying to work really hard to open up our central channel and move our wind, through some crazy practice that we are watching on YouTube or something, for example. But what we're doing is we're integrating that subtle and the gross form in a very settled way that we can place the mind and place the body as one. They're not these two separate entities. And so eventually in the Tanka, you see that the meditator is in a cave and he's meditating and everyone's just sort of clean and purified, and that sort of need for this distinction of the gross and the subtle has disappeared. The monkey is tame and you can meditate freely. That's the Dzogchen level of practice where you're just realizing the nature of mind. And from that, you see in the very top of the tanka where there's a like bunch of rainbows happening. So that's the rainbow body. That's the Jalu. And that's where, you can dissolve the form entirely and attain the rainbow body, which the Taoists also did. They also had rainbow body.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it is a very important practice. And a lot of times people really feel that this is very preliminary, but I will very often stop people from doing very complex practices and ask them to return to shamatha until I can stabilize some of those elemental factors in their body, because it really helps to be able to do that practice where you're actually cleansing this gross form of the body in union with settling the mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So then, so what you're saying is sometimes people can do these practices that deal just with the channels and energies, and it can cause the mental disturbance or
Yes.
back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they haven't learned to seat the mind yet,
Yeah.
because the mind and the body are actually connected. And we all know this in theory, right? This is like the whole premise of the New Age mindfulness term, right? We know that the body and the mind are connected. We know that our autonomic nervous system and our somatic nervous system, and we know that our mind follows what our body is feeling, and our body is feeling what our mind is feeling. Like we know that there's this deep connection to it, but we forget about that because we have great attachment to being superly great meditators. And so there's not a lot happening when you're just sitting with your mind.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of bells and whistles and fancy visualizations and things. You're just dealing with the form of your mind in your body and learning how to settle it. And so oftentimes, if somebody needs to calm down the wind, having a long shamatha practice is going to be far more beneficial to them than doing a short practice every single day. Oftentimes, people also say, I try and do 30 minutes every day. I once had a woman in a course I was teaching say, I work at a battered women's shelter.
Mm.
I'm trying to make my staff in our daily staff meetings do 10 minutes of meditation every day, and everybody hates it.
Mm,
And I don't know how to get them past hating it. And I was like, oh, well, you shouldn't do that every day. It should be once a week in one of your meetings, you have a 25-minute sit. That's it. Just 25 minutes once a week instead of 10 minutes every day. And she was like, oh, but if they hate it, I think that'll be worse. And I said, no, it'll be better because they will learn after like a certain amount of like mental gymnastics of hating it for the first 10 or 12 or 15 minutes or 19 minutes. Then that last 20 minutes, they will then feel the calmness from settling the mind throughout the day. And so this particular person came back about a year later to another meditation retreat and said, I have feedback for you. She said, I did that. And then now over half of my staff is doing weekly meditation on their own for 45 minutes a week.
wonderful.
So, right. So there's a way that we don't stir the pot in the same way that you're not going to go and want to sit next to a waterfall of thoughts all the time. You want to be able to get to that ocean of wisdom. And oceans will still have tsunamis and they will still have tropical storms and they'll have low tides and high tides and rough seas and smooth seas. But you'll be able to handle it more because you've kind of had those moments of seatedness, if you will. Those moments of tranquility give rise to a deeper understanding of the body and the mind connected.
Mhm,
And so there's far more benefit if somebody's new or life is really chaotic to just sticking it through a longer session so that you're not stirring it up. So it's like if it's rained and everything becomes very still afterwards and you go out and you look at a puddle of dirt, it's very clear, right? And then you can sort of see through it. But if you start to play with it and you stir it, then that becomes more difficult. And in that sense, meditation and working with the inner channels needs opportunity to be seated. It needs opportunity to rest in its own nature. And there's no shortcut to that. There's only working with one's mind.
mhm. Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think for the Western audience, it's hard sometimes because we don't have, you know, highly developed meditators walking around the neighborhood, so we kind of don't see what the goal, what's the possibility there. So when we first sit down,
Uh-huh.
we're like, maybe this isn't for me. We don't understand. Like you put in the work, you can get good at this, and it'll
Yeah.
really have nice benefits.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, it's kind of sold as like a spa day treatment.
Yeah. And I think there's benefit to that. I think there's benefit to a wider audience realizing that being aware of what our body and space is doing on a daily basis and the need to sort of have a spa day, if you will, or rest,
Mhm.
like rest the mind, rest the form, that gives rise to the awareness. If you can't rest the mind,
Yeah.
you're never going to get rise to the deeper clarity or that little bunny rabbit, that subtle aspect of oneself doesn't become luminous or clear unless you've actually learned how to settle. And so oftentimes when people begin with Vajrayana Buddhism, I have a really good friend who's a professor of Buddhism, and she says that starting the Vajrayana path is like strapping yourself into a roller coaster that you don't actually know what it looks like. It's kind of hidden behind a wall, if you will. But
Yeah.
you strap yourself in and you go, and you don't know how many loop-de-loops you got, or upside down, or big hills, or how terrifying it's going to be. But you're in it for the ride. And so it's really important to be able to have stability so that you can deal with the intensity that can arise as one is purifying aspects of lifetimes of karma, right? So when people are introduced to Vajrayana Buddhism and they feel this connection and they feel a devotion and they feel that something's happening here and I feel better, the tendency is to be very human about it and want to do more. So more is not always less. Sometimes just sitting with the mind is a whole lot more,
Mhm.
like Dzogchen level more.
Uh, so okay, since you brought up Dzogchen a little bit, sometimes you hear like so sometimes I think it's thought of that, that you do Dzogchen and you just sit in
Mhm.
the nature of awareness. And then, Mahamudra or other systems, you actually go through a systematic stage and you work with the subtle body and then you arrive at kind of resting in or the wisdom aspect. How do you juxtapose those two things? Like it's like in the shamatha there for the Dzogchen and the rabbit still holds, or is this
It still holds actually because, Mahamudra and Dzogchen are really two sides of the same coin,
right?
according to the teachings that I've received from my teacher, Kenshin Trungpa Rinpoche. He was a Mahamudra master. And, it all comes down to this weird term of emptiness that we talk about in Buddhism. And so people think that this emptiness is like a void of something. Or people say rest in the nature of mind, it's empty of nature.
Mhm.
And so people have this sort of like, blank screen kind of like idea of it. And really, if you look at Buddhist cosmology, um, interdependence is the relationship between our consciousness and the reality as we perceive it. So, how we are attributing a phenomenal perception of the world is not intrinsic to the object we're perceiving itself, according to Buddhism. So, in Mahamudra, we're going to ask ourselves the questions around um, what is my physiological response here? So my mind is acting as a filter. So then you're going to investigate the filter and you're going to see what shape it is, what color it is, how does it feel? Um, we can take that a step further and look at a physical connection within the nervous system itself. We can look at the function of our sense organs, how sense organs give rise to perception. We can think about the reaction of the nervous system, and we can really see how the filter the filter of what we perceive is really our own idiocentric kind of perception. If you have ever, do you speak another language at all? Do you
Uh,
speak any other languages?
Not well, but yes, little dabble here and there.
Yeah. So do you ever dream in another language?
I had when I was living in Turkey, I did.
Yeah. So sometimes, like, that's a really good example. I always know, like, I've kind of arrived in Asia when I start to dream in Tibetan. And every once in a while, I'll dream in Tibetan living in America.
Mhm.
But it's like the same idea that, the old adage is like holding up a cup and saying, this is a cup.
Yeah,
But in Tibetan, this is karyul.
yeah,
So it has a different word, it has a different meaning.
yeah.
Um, and so we can't really get stuck on a fixed definition because perception is based off of like culture, it's based off of language, it's based off of sense perception. And so this whole idea of grasping, quote, reality, um, can actually be very varied according to cultural background, education, definition of language, and um, we begin to understand slowly through this kind of process that the objects that we're perceiving as we perceive them are actually void of like a sovereign property,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So we can look at the table and we see that it's wood, but we don't have to necessarily believe that this is just wood, if you will.
Mhm.
This same reality can, in fact, be very different for different people. And so, therefore, it lacks permanence, right? It lacks the solidity. And so, this is relating directly to the sort of classic Buddhist viewpoint, um, where all things are empty in nature. So, it's actually more that everything is really full,
Mhm.
if you think about it. So, when we talk about resting in the nature of mind, it's realizing that we can actually take in all sense perceptions sort of simultaneously without laying on a judgment, laying on a notion of what we are perceiving and giving it some sort of solid definition. Do
Right.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, and so it's not a nothingness. And of course there's the Shentong view and the Rantong view, and that's a whole thing. But it's not a nihilistic view. It's not an empty of nature, nothing is there, void kind of idea. What we're talking about in that sense is that emptiness is itself an absence of independence. It's an absence of autonomy for sense perception. Rather, there's a merging and a realization of the interdependent nature of all phenomena, and that this law of interdependence um, means that what we perceive can develop itself in unlimited possibilities. So that is kind of the idea of the Dzogchen and Mahamudra sort of blended view as I understand it. Um, I'm not um, I'm not a great meditation practitioner by any means. I do very simple practice. Um, but the concept, as I've been pointed out by some very great masters, is that here in this sort of arena, emptiness is the ultimate nature of all things existing precisely because the phenomena that we're experiencing is actually void of a permanent existence. And in absence of that permanent existence, then the ultimate nature exists only due to your own perception. Does
Mhm.
that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so so today we wanted to talk about lung or energy a little bit, and I think that's a necessary doorway. So if somebody's perceiving everything as fixed, solid structures,
Hmm.
this is this, and then how do you really talk about this flow, this interconnected flow?
Right. And, the body itself is based off of these five elements. And so in meditation practice, it's very often seen that people dismiss this sort of direct physiological bodily experience when one is doing meditation practice for mental well-being, for example. Um, but the body is a vehicle for enlightenment,
Hmm.
right? So, you know, you cannot pursue enlightenment when you are distracted by the body. So there's that aspect of it. But additionally, um, you cannot merely identify elements and then think, you know, how can I say this? Oh, how should I better interact with these elements? You actually have to habitate them
Mhm.
habitually. You have to have a direct experience with how the physical elements in your form um, serve as a micro and a macrocosm for your human organism to be in this interdependent relationship with the macrocosm that exists outside of us. So that would be seasons, food that we take into our body, exercises and how we do them, meditations, visualizations, all of these things we have to we have to look at how we're inhabiting these elements and how we're sort of bumping up against them. And then with that, we then lay on top of that sort of sense perception and slow it down enough that we can be more clear, if we will, how we're interacting with our own elements and channels.
Mm. So this is really interesting. So this in this way, like our everyday experiences can start to become subtle body practices. If we begin seeing it that way, like how can I inhabit this quality?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the most brilliant sort of explainers of that was Thich Nhat Hanh. I mean,
Mm,
his little little instructions were just really lovely for pointing out
hmm
the ordinary enlightenment. Um, you know, if you talk about like, for example, the great Tibetan scholar and meditator Longchenpa, who was very well known for controlling his elements in his body to such a degree that he could just live on Chulin regeneration practices for years at a time. He didn't need to eat. Um, he was pointing out that um, enlightenment was not possible unless you gain control over these elements.
mm,
And this is only possible when you first examine and know the elements really well. So once you know the elements, you know their pathophysiology, you know how they run through the channels. Last time we met, I gave a very sort of detailed preliminary description of the formation of the channels. And so we talked about the blood and we talked about the white channels and the black channels and all of that. So to accomplish control over the bodily elements is to understand both those subtle and the gross aspects of how the lung moves through the body,
mhm,
um, through the three primary energies, how the three primary energies are related to the three root poisons, and how we push those with our habituation.
mhm,
So that that sort of gives rise to an understanding. So if we really want to know ourselves, if we really want to pursue enlightenment, we have to get really cozy with uncomfortable aspects of how we perpetuate our own root poisons,
mhm,
like how much we cherish our root poison, our primary root poison. Most of us have a combination of two that we tend to uh, really like, but sometimes occasionally you'll see a tridoshic person and there will be different things in different aspects of our life. Um, but the more we get to know how we express um, and create a deviation of homeostasis of five elements, then the easier it is to work with our own karmic propensities to doing that so that we can kind of see it arising. We can stop it before it actually harms a channel, before it actually becomes something that becomes like an internal blockage within our nervous system or even our aorta, for example. And Chinese medicine isn't far off that concept either. They also understand that the emotions can cause pathophysiology. Now, in Chinese medicine, wind is like, it's an evil pathogen. Like it's never like this great blessing that you see it in Tibetan medicine. And so there's a little dichotomy there. But if you go back to the five element root for the Chinese view, and again, you think about the Hun and this purpose, this sort of purpose that then goes and sort of bathes the heart with blood at night and kind of supplies the Shin with purpose, then that is the aspect of wind. That's the wood element, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's the vision, that's the clarity, that's the all of those kinds of things that when wind is in balance, we have great vision, right? We can actually see the nature of mind.
Mm.
That's to say that the winds are calm enough and are balanced enough that one can actually experience that non-dual fight that we have, um, thinking that we are somehow separate from everything else.
Mhm.
And it might be a glorious 2 seconds, but it's nice nonetheless. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think what we're saying is like, so just like in this, the shamatha tanka, you're saying the ability to know the winds relies on the ability to calm the mind. It
Yes,
it's always there, but you're just not going to be aware of it. It's going to be murky and it's not going to really be clear to you until you've done enough practice where the mind stops running so much, where those energies are just shooting you all around.
totally. And if you look at any tanka or you look at any rupa, a statue of any deity, um, they all have a moon disk,
Hmm.
don't they? Yeah,
Hmm.
that moon disk is the seat. And the word stable and sort of understanding like a seat is like thinking in terms of like we call it say ten and tenpa in Tibetan. And it's like saying that you have a seat in which to settle,
Hmm.
right? Or sometimes if you're in beginning stages of learning a sadhana or a practice, the moon disk arises and then the seed syllable appears, and then maybe there's a light,
Yeah.
right? And that's where people should just begin in like a preliminary stage of like becoming to like connect to that energy of that deity. So like when I teach medicine Buddha, for example, I often will tell people begin with the moon disk. The moon disk is where you place your mind. So that's like the same thing as shamatha. And then from that, you see this beautiful radiant blue light. And if it's just blue light, that's enough until you have that tangible connection in your own sort of somatic self that you are connected, that you are sitting in front of an enlightened being in front of you, hovering in front of you, who you've invited into your field, right? And then maybe a seed syllable will arise. And as your mind becomes more stable and more connected and more stable and more connected, then you begin to see, in the right hand of the medicine Buddha, he is holding this Arura plant, and it is in the mudra of supreme generosity on the relative level, the physical form, the physical alleviation of suffering. In his left hand, he has a bowl. This bowl is representing the ultimate level. So these are the two truths that we always hear about. And so then you begin to construct his robes look like this. He's luminous like this. Okay, now that's really stable. Now we're going to move through the lights and the syllables that are going to radiate from the forehead, from the throat, and from the heart. And so it's a systematic development where your body itself is open enough to receive each level of that. And it could be any deity, right? It could be Chenrezi. Okay. I see the moon disk. All right, I'm seeing this beautiful white luminous light. Oh, he has four arms. Okay, in his hands are this. So, and each stage you're like really working at making that connection to that non-duality, but the energies that they have. So if it's Manjushri, it's an orange light, for example, and you're feeling the energy of clarity and wisdom cutting through your own ignorance. So each of the deities are representing an aspect inside yourself that you're trying to purify
Mhm.
in your own channels. Literally in Nundra, when we're doing, or like Vajrasattva practice, for example, where the foot is tipped down and dripping from his foot is this nectar that can come into you and like clean all your channels.
Yes.
So you can't do those visualizations in a way that is going to effectively cleanse and purify your channels unless you have placed the mind, because that takes meditation concentration.
Mhm.
And for that, you need the shamatha. For
Mhm.
that, you need to place the mind in a really non-dual way so that we're not just thinking, oh, I'm just imagining this like blue Buddha is coming in front of me and there's these lights and it's coming into my body and it's doing this thing. And it's so it's not connected. So
Mhm.
to have that connection, to have that devotion is to go back to that same concept of the view that our perception is actually empty,
Mhm.
that our perception is that it's already completely connected because it's timeless, right? The
Mhm.
deity comes because the deity is already here, and
Mhm.
we've invited the deity because we have a connection to the deity. You
Mhm.
see, and so all of that is going to have an impact on the internal channels. And different practices will work with the different aspects of the three root poisons. So sometimes we can prescribe practices based off of where a patient's root poison is really self-cherishing. So really stuck. And
Right.
so a really true master, like when one finds a master that they can work with, they can actually recognize that. So that's why sometimes teachers will say, I want you to do this mantra. I want you to do this practice because they have such a clear perception of reality and how that is sticking in your physical form that they want to help unstick that. And so they're giving a prescription of do this particular practice because they want you to be able to do that. And most of the time in ancient times, it was said that you would watch a teacher for like 3 years before you would even ask them to be your teacher
Mhm.
because you wanted to know that the connection and the tendril was there. And so I think oftentimes people are now um, going for having, oh, this incredible teacher is coming and they're giving this empowerment and I have to receive it. And I would caution people to not do too much of that because you need to find what wakes you up and just focus on that. So if that means that it's a devotion to a dog tooth, that's fine because that's pure perception, right? In her mind, pure perception was that dog tooth. And so it was the same level of devotion as she would have to an actual tooth of the Buddha, and she was able to attain some signs of realization upon her death, right?
Mhm.
And so our perception and the son's perception is, oh, my mother's just like worshiping a dog tooth. Not only am I a bad son, but that is ridiculous. So the perception that it's ridiculous is based off of an idea or a concept of static reality.
Mhm.
And so when we work with the channels in a different way and we meet ourselves, when we meet head on with our own passion, aggression, and ignorance, we have a very different sensation. We have a very different perception. And wind is the troublemaker. Wind drives everything.
Mhm.
Everything born out of ignorance, but ignorance creates more ignorance, ignorance creates aggression, and ignorance creates attachment. So attachment is associated with wind, and wind is very much the little devil that sits on your shoulder and is like, eat the chocolate, stay up late watching cat videos, like have the bad relationship, stay in the job you hate because you love the money. Um, continue talking with your toxic relative because you have to, whatever that is, wind is sort of that kind of attachment to that dualism. It's the attachment to wanting something to be the way that we want it,
Mhm.
right? So wind is quite simply put a jerk, really. It's our inner jerk.
And, and wind, you're just for the audience, wind is energy.
Yes, lung wind is energy. Yeah. It's basically like the equivalency of chi.
Yeah. So this is very interesting the way you're saying this though, because I think most people think, oh, cheese, this great thing, or wind's this great thing, and you're saying wind's a jerk.
I mean, it can be, right? Or it can be total pure perception, right? It can transform into the basic nature of reality and all mind in a Dzogchen state of complete bliss. Or it can be this trapping of wants, needs, thoughts, desires, grasping, my precious, my precious. It's the golem, like, me wants it, it's that kind of pushiness. And
Mhm.
that's why if you think about the nervous system and how much lung and wind relates with the nervous system, and we think about the nervous system's response to desire, for example, what happens to the body,
Mhm.
or we even think about going on like that nice vacation on the beach. We have a nervous system response. We think about having to go to the job we hate. We have a nervous system response. We think about that we're so tired, but we have to get something done. That's a nervous system response.
Mhm.
So all of those nervous system responses are running with the energy that's in the body. And so
Mhm.
um, having having that subtle in a way that we can seed it allows us to look more dynamically at our full picture of our root poison experience, if you will. Um, because it's said in the tantras that wind creates disease, it pushes disease, it rolls disease, and it hardens disease.
Mhm.
So it's said that if you can control the wind, that you can control disease. And so that's like a really brilliant statement right there. And in that way, meditation becomes medicine because when you can control the subtle and the gross body, the background noise of the root poison settles, and then the nature of reality can arise. And then the winds can flow smoother. The channels are more open. We've purified previous karmas. There's a lot of possibility there.
So in this way, the winds are settled through a relaxed mind. Like if you leave them alone, they create blisses. If you mess with them in attachment and stuff, then they create sickness.
On one level, that is true. On another level, you actually must move the winds in a particular way to attain certain states of consciousness.
Mm,
But you cannot move those winds in particular ways unless you know how to return them to the balanced state.
mm,
So when I talk about Western people jumping into advanced wind practices before they are physically, emotionally, psychologically ready to do so, um, you're talking about pushing the wind into like the central channel, for example.
mhm,
Um, that can be fine as long as you know how to dissolve the practice. So in Vajrayana, we have generation and completion stage practice. So we can generate a practice where we are embodying enlightened beings. And we are, in a sense, actually fully embodied in our own bodies because we're already enlightened beings. We just have all the dust in our eyes. And therefore, you know, practice can allow that inner lumosity to appear. So that's where the nature of the mind becomes just naturally luminous, naturally apparent, naturally arises because we haven't continued our, clinging to it. And yet, if we push a wind into a particular channel, for example, and we haven't learned how to just relax into that nature of mind, then that wind is stuck in there and it may not belong in there 24/7.
Mm.
So when I've read the pulses of really great masters and rinpoches, the wind aspects of their pulse is almost pathophysiological in a sense. Like you have to read through that. It's not, there's just something else that's happening in their bodies. Their bodies are very, very different. Oh, sorry, that's my husband. I thought I put it on silent. Um, so their bodies are um when you read the pulse of a enlightened being, um, a Rinpoche, someone who has a grasp of the nature of mind, their wind moves very differently through the channels than an ordinary person. And they then know how to settle that back down again, is what I'm saying.
Mhm.
It's continuously running on a higher level. It's like a higher frequency, if you will. Um, but they still have a physical form, and so there could still be a pathological wind,
Mm.
um, where they could have an illness or they could have something like that. But their subtle aspects are very different.
Mhm.
And so these high level practices really need to be given at times where there's instructions, and they need to make sure that the physical form has the capacity to handle it without creating a secondary sort of condition,
Yeah.
if you will.
Hmm. And I think I asked you a similar question to this last time, but we seem to be a little more dialed in on it right now. So they do have the ability to the work with the winds.
Hmm.
But then you would, from an outsider point of view, it would seem like then if they got sick, they would be able to also work with that wind and deal with that,
Hmm.
the pathological side of things. But I guess also, does this also depend upon training? Like it might not be in their wheelhouse, like it might be outside of their, different type. I mean, it's a vast thing, the body and the wind, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are, it's funny because sometimes I would ask my teacher a particular question about the subtle winds, and he would say, "Oh, you need a Dr. Rinpoche to answer that."
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I would ask to Dr. Rinpoche, and then they would have a completely different answer.
Right.
Um, so there is a marriage between medicine and Dharma. Of course, Dharma is the great medicine,
Mhm.
but I think I had said last time, they're demonstrating impermanence to
Yeah.
us.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of their gift of, demonstrating impermanence. And when I would ask Kenshin Trungpa Rinpoche to live to 100 years, and he would chuckle at me, you know, that was my attachment for him. That was my great love and devotion to him, that I wanted him around longer.
Mhm.
And now that he has passed from his physical form, people talk about how your guru is even closer to you
Mhm.
than when they were alive.
Yeah.
And it's true.
Yeah.
It's true because he doesn't have the barrier of the physical form. His mind state is like immediately accessible
Yeah.
to his students.
Mhm.
And it's a very different, it's still a very, very felt experience, but there's no form.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think that great masters who are demonstrating impermanence to us are also giving us a teaching about form and formlessness,
Yeah.
um, that can sometimes be very painful to watch, um, as we're watching people leave their form. I just, in the last couple weeks, helped a longtime patient of mine, like more than 16 years was my patient, and they just passed of a pretty intense illness. And I went every single day, for the last week of their life, to work on them, to give them comfort, so that I was pushing the edema out of their feet, and
Mm.
I was, explaining to them what was happening with their elements, and just, you know, trying to give ease to the whole transition. And at one point I said to them, you're doing such a good job. Dying is really, really hard work.
Mhm.
You're doing great. Keep going, you know? And I think that we all need to experience impermanence on that level to realize the great preciousness of the opportunity of our human life as well. And I
Mhm.
think that sometimes great masters are demonstrating that, so that what is the expression that they attribute to the Buddha? The thing is that you think you have time,
Mm.
right? Have you
Mhm.
ever heard that?
Yeah.
You think you have time,
Right.
right? We think we have time, but we don't actually, because it's so fleeting. And
Right.
if you think about what I said at the beginning of our talk today, where I said it's kind of like placing a bookmark, you know, Dharma practice is like a bookmark, studying medicine is like a bookmark, a lifetime is a bookmark, and then we come back and we take up from where we were from the Buddhist point of view from our previous life. And so you really want to take advantage as much as you can. You know, I'm guilty of it too. Once I get my children grown, I'll go on a longer retreat. Doctors don't really get long retreats. We have very short retreats because everybody's after us all the time. But, you know, I still have young children. My youngest is 9. So I can get away for about a month at a time, and that's about it. And that's because I have a gracious husband. But longer retreats are, if you can get them done, like, life is swift, it's time to do it.